When a narcissistic person senses that you kind of see what they're about, that you're able to see past their shiny charm and charisma, that you kind of see through to their grift, they don't like that. And they are perceptive. And this, in fact, is why knowing what narcissism is and the warning signs like charm and charisma and that sort of performative empathy, it's so important to know this. It's why this channel exists. One thing we know is that narcissistic people cannot emotionally regulate. And one of the biggest problems, and I'd say the biggest issues in narcissistic relationships, originate from the fact that narcissistic people are so dysregulated. They either scream and yell if they don't get their way, or they give you the silent treatment. And long story short, that is how we end up with the eggshell walking, the balancing on a razor that characterizes just about every antagonistic or narcissistic relationship. If you have been in a narcissistic relationship for long enough, or you grew up with a narcissistic parent, you never really got healthy models of regulation. And as a result, raging, screaming anger can become normalized, or any form of anger can become terrifying. Alternately, your fears of abandonment may have been stoked by a parent who expressed their anger through withholding or withdrawal anytime the parent didn't get their way. So from a very early age, you became masterful at completely and utterly catering to the needs of other people. So that may leave you wondering, if all I've ever seen, or most of what I see, is dysregulation or unhealthy regulation, what exactly does healthy regulation look like? Now, if you've never really been in a relationship where that is happening, or you even struggle with it yourself, that may be a big question. By and large, most survivors of narcissistic and antagonistic relationships overregulate. You keep it all bottled up, right? And that definitely is going to take a toll on your physical and your mental health. It's not a bad strategy, right? There's no point in speaking out in the relationship, so the overregulation may be the only way to stay safe. And in fact, speaking out may even make things worse. So maybe for a lifetime, you learn to push it all down and even find that you're not even able to cry or let out emotion in any way. And you may feel quite distanced from how you feel or even what you're allowed to feel. But that, again, begs the question of what this video is about. What exactly then qualifies as healthy regulation? Here are some thoughts on that. In a person who is healthily regulated, you actually express the emotion appropriately. You give yourself permission to identify the emotion and to respond to it. Maybe you'll cry if you're sad. Take a break and maybe some time to work to yourself, to work through some anger. Laughing when you're happy and you're able to articulate the emotion. I feel really angry right now. And then articulate what you need. Like, I just need a minute to sit with this. Though, gotta keep this in mind. Just because you regulate and express the emotion, it doesn't mean that the other person you're with will either hear it right or cooperate. But whether you do it alone or with someone else or in a place where you can share it, you name it, you express it, you feel it, you process it. Not any way you want, that's what I mean by the sort of appropriate, but you express it, you feel it. The second way is you recognize that your emotion is yours and it may not necessarily be someone else's. Healthy regulation means owning your emotion as your emotion. Sort of this idea of, I feel this, but I recognize that someone else may not. And not shove your emotion down someone else's throat. You wouldn't say things like, how can you not be angry? How are you not sad right now? That's not good regulation. Third, you express your emotion appropriately. You do not scream and frighten people because you're angry. You do not threaten because you're really angry. You don't engage in violence. You don't break things. You don't just walk away. You don't just hang up the phone without explaining that you're stepping away for a moment. People who hang up phones are often dysregulated. Number 4, you read the room. We aren't 2 years old anymore. We can't just express emotion the way we want, anytime we want. Now listen, you may not start sobbing in the middle of a staff meeting or start making someone else's conversation or stuff about you and your friends solely, for example. We don't turn off our feelings, but we also cannot expect the world to stop for our feelings. So it's knowing them, feeling them, identifying them, but also reading the room. Number 5, we figure out techniques that work for us to manage emotion. Meditation, mindfulness, breathing, exercise, the things that help us manage these feelings that we identified. And we need to feel, but we can't just spew our feelings all over the place whenever we want. Listen, 3 deep breaths could change the world. Allow you to stop before you respond or react. Number 6, we view both sides of a situation. We feel the feeling, but we also account for the idea that there are 2 experiences. I know what you're thinking. Oh, the narcissistic people never do this. They're not regulated. But regulation requires knowing that we are not the center of the universe, that other people are indeed having an experience too. It doesn't mean that you don't have your feelings. It also means, yes, your feelings are valid, but we are also able to take some perspective, breathe. We remain angry. We can remain sad, disappointed, whatever it is we're feeling, but also know that not everyone else is having your experience. Number 7, we also need to remember that not expressing your feelings is not regulation. That's a common myth. And we often praise people for being stoic and keeping their feelings to themselves, toughing it out and never crying. When I see that, in essence, I see a psychological time bomb that may end up coming back to harm the person in terms of physical illness, physiological wear and tear, self-blame, anxiety. It's important that you break out of that myth, because many survivors of narcissistic abuse may believe that they're doing a great job of regulating because they aren't saying or doing or feeling anything, because they aren't making noise, they aren't talking about it, they aren't disrupting, and they're just keeping it all in. But it's the indoctrination of the narcissistic relationship, right? That your emotions are not valid or in fact wrong, so you smush them down. In fact, some survivors may find that after weeks, months, or years of keeping it all in, that they may find that they hit a boiling point and they'll blow, even during a smaller interaction with a narcissistic person, which only fuels the narcissistic person's gaslighting and painting the other person as being overly emotional and dramatic, and all of that fuels the experience of any narcissistically abused person, and it fuels their self-blame, their self-doubt, and even the sense of, yep, it's me, I'm the problem, I'm too sensitive, I'm too reactive. Maybe it's not even that they're narcissistic, I'm beginning to think I'm the problem. Now, poor regulation is something we may even see as part of various mental health issues. Personality disorders, substance use, some mood disorders, some anxiety disorders, impulse control disorders, complex traumas. All of these patterns do have dysregulation as part of their picture. And treatments for many of these things will also work on the dysregulation or the over-regulation that people experience. However, for narcissistic people, the lack of self-awareness means that they do not see their dysregulation as a problem. So they're rarely going to change. For other folks, it's a combination. They can address regulation through a combination of therapy, regulation techniques, and in some cases, medication. It's tough when you've always been around a lot of narcissistic relationships because you're surrounded by dysregulation and you never got a mirror for what healthy regulation is. Regulation is identification, expression, and actually feeling feelings and emotion in a way that is honest, but also self-aware and empathic. You may have a strong feeling about a child spilling milk on a busy day, but you don't start screaming at them. You may clean it up, and even with a trembling voice may say, "Hey, sweetie, it's okay. I just need to go to the bathroom." And then when you get to the bathroom, you cry it out a little. Regulation may mean that the narcissistic person gaslights you for the 1,000th time, and you don't tell them that they're an a-hole or rage at them, but you take a moment You recognize that this person's behavior is reprehensible, that you're angry. You may not tell them, but you let yourself inside of you call it anger rather than, I can be strong and stoic, or maybe they're right, or maybe you say things like, I'm so dumb. It's not an easy line to walk in a narcissistic relationship, and it requires daily recalibration. But if you can get this regulation stuff worked out for yourself, it can be one of the healthiest things you do for your mental health. Let's talk about expressing needs. That shouldn't be that hard, harder than we think it should be for something so fundamental to being a human being, and impossible in a narcissistic relationship. Something that happens to folks in these relationships, though, is you never know what the healthy version looks like, right? You've been in this distorted universe for so long, you're like, what does healthy look like? What is it supposed to look like when you actually express a need? Let's break that down. Okay, so you're in a narcissistic relationship. You probably are or have been. You're watching this channel. And you express a need. You express a want. Maybe you express an opinion. What happens? You drop your thoughts in the comments, but what happens is 9 times out of 10, it's rage, gaslighting, manipulation, you're so selfish, eye-rolling, oppositionality, especially if what you're asking inconveniences them in any way. Over time, especially if you grew up with a narcissistic parent, expressing needs is either something you didn't learn, couldn't learn, or you were shamed for, probably all 3. And if it happens long enough, this sort of territory of expressing needs becomes really fraught. In my clinical experience, and frankly also in my personal experience, I have witnessed people who have experienced long-term narcissistic relationships take a variety of approaches to doing this. Some folks in long-term relationships in particular just stop ever expressing a need and do everything themselves, effectively exhausting themselves. Some folks will report feeling nauseous, anxious, and even panicky before they have to ask the narcissist for something. Other people blame themselves and believe the gaslighted BS that they're being sold, that they're being selfish for making a need known. Other folks choose their battles, but they still feel the sting that this person they're in a relationship with will do nothing, and then ultimately will try to do what the narcissistic person needs sometimes, in hopes of at least kind of quid pro quo. That doesn't tend to work all either. It's all quid and no quo. Then there are the deeper fears and feelings that come when you think about expressing a need to a narcissistic person. And these may connect to much more primal and primitive fears. For example, a fear of abandonment, a fear of being viewed as spoiled or selfish, a fear of rage and anger. And those fears are enough to hold you back, and they're realistic fears. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. Now, as a psychologist who has worked for years and years with people who have experienced narcissistic abuse, and I've also worked with a lot of narcissistic clients, I know that the folks who are experiencing the narcissistic relationships will apologize about 25 times in my practice if they need to change an appointment with me or ask for a different time or they have an emergency. The narcissistic people I've worked with will tell me, well, can't you just ask another patient to change to the afternoon so it can be at a time I want it to be at? Or my favorite was when I was actually moving my schedule around to make time for an acute call for a client who requested it on a very busy day. And I offered them the only time I could create by moving the other appointments around. And the narcissistic person said, I can't do 10 a.m. That's a little early for me because I like to wake up slowly and I like to take my time meditating with my trainer. Needless as I said to him, no call for you, dude. I hope the cardio and the meditation help you figure it out. Or my very fave is when the narcissistic client would let me know 5 minutes before the appointment that they can't make it, but that please don't charge me a cancellation because I didn't mean to forget to call you. I just forgot. The narcissistic people and their entitlement make them so good at making their twisted needs known or demanded. Frankly, it's not okay, but they're really good at making their needs known. So all of this, though, begs the question, how do healthy, agreeable, well-regulated people respond when you express a need, a want, or even a thought or belief? First of all, a healthy person will hear your need or want non-judgmentally. Now, don't mistake that with the idea that they will always meet your needs. They may not be able to, they may not want to, they may lack the time, they may lack the resource, but they'll hear it. And then secondly, they will not shame what you are asking for. As I said, if they can't meet it, they may respectfully say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't do that." Or "I can't do that. I can do it, but I won't be able to do it until later." They will hear you. They will answer you, but they won't say, "I can't do that. Like, what the hell?" Healthy people will also sometimes, and in fact quite often, try to help you work a solution, especially if they can't meet the need. They may offer up suggestions or alternatives. And hold on to your hats, folks. Healthy people may even sometimes make sacrifices if you really need something. For example, you may need a ride to a doctor's appointment that is out of the way, and someone may say to you, a healthy person may say to you, "Sure, I can do that, and I have an errand to run around there that I'll try and get done at the same time." Or they might even say something like, "Oh, just take my car, just drop me off at work. I'm just going to be sitting there all day, just get me later." It's not a thing. They'll just do it because it's easy, and they just want to do it to be there for you. Healthy people will simply listen. They will just listen to what you want or need, and simply having someone not judging you or shutting you down or saying no before you can even complete your sentence actually can often be more important than that other person saying yes to your need. Another thing a healthy person will do is they will not sound like a spoiled teenager. If you ask them something simple, like, "Can you bring in the trash cans? Can you empty the dishwasher? Can you run that laundry upstairs?" They won't become sullen and say things like, "You can't make me do that," or they'll just huff and grump. Healthy people will say, "Sure," and they'll do it, or they'll calmly say, "Give me a minute, I can't do it right now, but I'll absolutely get to it," and they'll actually get to it. Healthy people won't ignore you. Sometimes if the narcissistic person doesn't like what you have to say, they'll just ignore you. And that does not feel good, but it's what they do. And you may repeat it, or you may say it louder, and then they'll get mad and gaslight you. "Why are you talking to me like that?" A healthy person will listen and respond. For example, that text message you send them, asking them to confirm a date for something, they will actually respond in a timely manner and not make you wait 3 days like many narcissistic people do, and then get mad that you didn't follow up when the thing falls through. I would also file this idea of preferences under wants and sometimes even needs. It may be your preference, for example, for a certain kind of food, or maybe an intolerance you had for a food like dairy, or the noise level of a place you're going to be going for a dinner, or a type of movie. As you can imagine, in a narcissistic relationship, if you make those preferences known, you'll be painted as fussy, particular, difficult, and demanding. However, if the narcissistic person had any preferences, the world is expected to stop and accommodate. If you make a preference known to a healthy person, they will acknowledge it and do their best to meet it in most cases, or let you know if they cannot. For example, this is a silly example, but a healthy person may say, "Hey, most of these pizzas have cheese, but I made a smaller one with just veggies." Or at the very least, they might say, "I hear you. Let's do our best with this. I'm so sorry if it isn't working, and then we can figure it out." No shaming, no blaming, just trying to land on a solution. Healthy people, above all else, are flexible. You know how people do yoga and Pilates and all kinds of exercises to become more flexible because that's good for your body? Your psyche is no different. More flexible is more healthy, more resilient. You have better coping, better health. But, drum roll, interestingly, which are the most rigid personalities? Those are the narcissistic and the antagonistic folks. And ultimately, the healthy people out there and their psychological flexibility, sadly, are often compelled to bend to the will of the rigid, antagonistic, and narcissistic folks. The narcissists, as a result, almost always get their needs met, and the rest of us don't. And remember, this entire sort of conversation isn't just about voicing your needs, but sometimes it's about being able to voice a thought, a belief, or an opinion. Again, simply not possible in a narcissistic relationship. But in a healthy relationship, even if your beliefs or opinions are different, they will be able to hear you and respectfully say that they disagree. I had something like this happen to me recently. I think I'm generally agreeable. A test told me I was. I know I am. I'm sure there's people out there who might differ on that. And I was talking to a person who was very agreeable, but who had very different opinions than mine. I really don't agree with this person's opinions. I am very fond of them, but I don't agree with them. And I made a little wincy face and I said, I hear you. I can see that what you're talking about is important to you. I don't agree with you. My experience is really different, but I also understand what you believe. It's not always easy when we're in these situations, folks. In this case, her and I felt incredibly different about something, but I breathed and thought about how to respond so I wasn't disrespectful and also didn't just cave, and I did express my disagreement. It was healthy on both sides. She did not interrupt me when I shared my point of view. It can happen, but you need two healthy people at the table. If enough key people around you are narcissistic, you simply never get the chance to flex the need-expressing muscle or believe that your beliefs are worth sharing or even that your preferences are worth being made known. But perhaps knowing what it can look like, and frankly should look like, can hopefully give you some perspective of where this bar should be set, rather than where the bar got set in a narcissistic relationship.
Let's talk about the difference between seeking approval and seeking admiration. So a lot of people have wondered about this one, and it was a great question when it came up. I'm like, oh, I should take this one on. Admiration and approval seeking are very different dynamics that can often get confused in the conversation about narcissism and narcissistic abuse, and can leave people who are survivors of narcissistic abuse sometimes wondering if they are the one that's the narcissist. Seeking admiration and validation is one of the core dynamics of narcissism, as you know, and honestly is observed in every narcissistic person out there. It's sort of a required ingredient. We have covered this so many times on this channel, but just as a reminder that validation and admiration seeking is a way for the narcissistic person to keep any threats to their fragile ego at bay. The more admiration they get, the more soothed that they are. So everything in their lives tilts towards them seeking out admiration. And if they don't get the admiration, they get really irritable and angry. Admiration is a tool of regulation for them. So a person who is clearly not narcissistic was asking me, and she was wondering, she said, am I the one who's narcissistic? Because I really do seek approval. And she said she was confused because the approval seeking has landed her in more than a few narcissistic relationships. And I thought, wow, I've heard this question before from so many survivors. This person was confused whether approval seeking and admiration seeking were the same thing, because then she got afraid, oh my gosh, what if I'm the narcissist? And this is a person who had narcissistic parents, who had to sort of really fend for themselves at a rather young age, and then actually went into a couple of marriages with malignant narcissists. She was never noticed for the things she did, never really got recognition, and certainly didn't get approval of any kind from her parents. And she found that she spent her adult life trying to seek out approval, not admiration. Admiration and approval are not the same thing. But once she said that, I thought, wow, it's a really interesting point. And I really could understand that confusion, something that's come up with survivors. Seeking approval is a different process than admiration. Seeking approval is the asking, am I okay? Am I enough? Please let me know if I'm doing okay. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse, especially childhood narcissistic abuse, find that seeking approval is a core dynamic for them throughout their lives. The narcissistic parent was too self-obsessed to notice their children for any extended period of time. And if they finally did, it would typically be to yell at them, criticize them, or because they were inconvenienced by their children. Every child wants their parent to notice them and value them. And when that doesn't happen, it can leave that child going into adulthood craving approval from their parent, from their partner, from their boss, from strangers. It's a lifetime grail quest of wanting and waiting to hear that you are enough. Oh boy, you sure did a good job. And sadly, for those who had narcissistic parents, even when that approval finally comes, it can often be met with self-doubt and fear that it will disappear if you make even one wrong move. Admiration, on the other hand, is praise, compliments, praise, likes, fawning, prizes, rewards. Approval is validation of being good, someone telling you that they're okay with you. It's not nearly as exciting as admiration, but more of a person saying that you did something or are something good. It's almost like, I don't know, this is cynical, but someone sort of signing off on you when you get their approval. Where it gets tricky is that narcissistic folks not only seek admiration, they also do seek approval. Remember, many narcissistic folks did have narcissistic parents, so they didn't get noticed either. They too wanted to be seen and approved of and all the rest of it. So not only are the narcissistic folks roaming around looking for 24/7 admiration, at the same time, they're also looking for approval. And that right there is where some of this confusion sets in. The people experiencing narcissistic abuse aren't looking for admiration, but they're looking for approval. So there's sort of the inflection point. And looking for approval, frankly, makes us vulnerable. It puts us in adult relationships where we are working through that early parental approval seeking stuff, wanting our parents to approve of us. It makes people particularly vulnerable to narcissistic people and their machinations. When you are waiting for approval, there's sort of a built-in devaluation. There is not that internal voice saying you did good, even if the world doesn't applaud, or that you know you made a real and strong effort. The approval that we all want is in your own self-validation of the effort that you put in or the quality of it. It's tasting the food you cooked and saying, yeah, wow, that's really good. Or reading something that you wrote and saying, wow, that's actually solid. Or looking at something you built and saying, oh, that looks really good. But most people who have survived narcissistic abuse, especially in childhood, do not have that inner self-affirming voice. Instead, there is a voice that is invalidating and in desperate need for approval. So that voice and person go out there and hope to get it from the people in their lives rather than hearing it internally. Approval seeking can also be part of that fawn response we have talked about as part of the sympathetic nervous system response to narcissism and narcissists. We want the narcissist to approve of us, don't we? Often because they remind us of the narcissistic or invalidating parent. And we keep trying harder and harder to get their approval. When narcissistic folks seek out approval, they always tend to want to punch up. They seek out that approval from people that they think are valuable, powerful, rich, famous. Your approval, my approval, doesn't matter so much to them. But when they think someone can make something big happen for them, that is when the approval seeking for a narcissist really kicks in. For a non-narcissistic person, approval seeking characterizes all their relationships if they've gone through narcissistic abuse. Doesn't matter if the person we're seeking is more powerful than us, less powerful than us, it doesn't matter. So there's also another difference. Now, the catch-22 for survivors is wanting approval and simultaneously feeling not good enough. And that's the ringer. So as a quick summary, many people who have been narcissistically abused or are vulnerable to narcissistic people seek approval. Our chronic quest to please oftentimes unpleasable parents, but other unpleasable systems, but unpleasable parents, partners, or invalidators in our midst. Narcissists as well, they want approval, but they tend to seek approval from people they think are more powerful than them. Narcissists also seek admiration, which is praise and compliments and kudos and bravo and you're so great. There's a difference. Admiration seeking tends to be more grandiose. So for those of you out there that recognize that you often seek out approval, but while admiration feels good, it isn't that much of a driver for you, you're probably not narcissistic, but rather one of the many on the journey wanting to finally be seen and heard. The healing happens when you see yourself. And if other people approve too, well, that's just the gravy. And again, just to be clear, I'm not saying any of us are above admiration. Who doesn't like kind of having the pat on our back and saying, wow, that's great, or getting some kind of award or recognition? That's a human want, but it doesn't need to be a human need.
So you don't need to know the criteria or the characteristics that comprise a narcissistic personality to know that people with a narcissistic personality style lack empathy. Maybe they have some variable empathy. They turn empathy on and off to get what they want. But if you're in their presence, it doesn't really feel like empathy because it's definitely not consistent. Being nice to you on a day that is a good day for them is not empathy. That's a coincidence. Don't confuse the two. Empathy, and I will be putting out some more detailed videos on empathy in the weeks to come. It's a funny thing. It's not as simple as saying, I feel you, or that must be hard. It's a bunch of different micro things we do in response to a person who's going through something, and there are different kinds of empathy. It's not just the words, it's the emotions on the empathic person's face. It's a person slowing down and actually listening to you, and in some cases, as we see, for example, with compassionate empathy, they don't just say, that must be hard. They actually try to do something to help you. Now, empathy requires being attuned enough to other people that you are aware of their emotional states and you respond to those emotional states in a self-aware and other-aware, frankly, manner. And you're aware of yourself and how you affect other people, right? Now, obviously, narcissistic people do none of that consistently, and they do none of it genuinely. When a narcissistic person looks empathic, it's usually performative or transactional. They do it to get something they need or to feel better about themselves. So here's where the paradox comes up. If there's one thing we know about a narcissistic person, it's that they are one hell of a salesperson. And that's why narcissistic people make such good CEOs, politicians, influencers, anything where they are trying to convince someone of something that benefits the narcissist and may or may not benefit the other person, but they try to make that other person think it's benefiting them, right? And the reason that they're so good at it is that because they are very socially perceptive. You heard that right. Narcissistic people are very socially perceptive. They're actually more attuned than you could ever imagine. They may actually pick up a tiny change in someone else's expression that other people may miss. They may pick up a shift in the energy of the room. They're very aware of other people. And they take that awareness and either perceive it as a threat or they use it to their advantage. Because empathy is not just awareness. Empathy is an emotional attunement, an awareness of other people and an awareness of self. And it is about caring about other people in a way that their emotions matter. You aren't just studying the other person when you're empathic. You are concerned. You're concerning yourself with their welfare. The narcissistic person's social perceptiveness and awareness is just that. It's a study. It's an analysis. It's almost like a thief casing a bank or a store or a house before they burglarize it. The social perceptiveness of the narcissistic person means that they are learning the equivalent of the exits, the entrances, the unlocked windows, the timings of when the deliveries come, when the guard goes on the break, right? It's acute observation. They're doing the equivalent of that with you. There's nothing empathic about it, though. The social perceptiveness and analysis of narcissistic people mean that they can look very interpersonally skilled. It's the core of the charm and the charisma. They know how to hold conversations with a wide variety of people. They are able to figure out the temperature of the room. But their social perceptiveness and their sort of attunement, for as long as it lasts, is not serving an empathic function. It's doing two things. First, it's getting the narcissistic person's supply. Most people out there think that someone who asks good questions and is really paying attention, they'll think that person is empathic, and will often get into a conversation with a narcissistic person and in fact think and say like, oh, what a great person. And the supply for the narcissistic person, in some cases, it may simply be the information they get about a person from a conversation, but it also may be them learning how another person ticks. Or it could be getting attention and being told that they're great. The other thing that the narcissistic person is doing in their intent conversations is sussing out threat. Narcissistic people tend to be very suspicious. They are always scanning the room and determining where the threats lie. And when I say threat, I don't mean that they are looking for someone who is literally going to physically harm them. They are also scanning the room to determine if someone in the room may be smarter than them. Someone who may kind of be onto them. Might be someone whom they may not be able to play. And here is where it gets really interesting. And keeping in mind that all of this is happening at a rather deep, out of consciousness level for the narcissistic person, they are also scanning to figure out who really sees them, who kind of has their number. Any of you who have been truth tellers in a family system, you get this. And from an early age, you kind of had your parents' number, which may have turned you into a scapegoat. When a narcissistic person senses that you kind of see what they're about, that you're able to see past their shiny charm and charisma, that you kind of see through to their grift, they don't like that. And they are perceptive. And this, in fact, is why knowing what narcissism is and the warning signs like charm and charisma and that sort of performative empathy, it's so important to know this. It's why this channel exists. Because you may be able to dodge them early on simply by being perceptive and not falling for their grift. And what often happens is that a narcissistic person is often able to work a lot of the room, but not some selected people in it. And they will waste no time in talking smack about the people who the narcissistic person knows they can't quite play or manipulate, right? So they know they got your number. They'll say, I don't know, do any of you like that person? I don't trust them. I have been in this situation. I loathe fancy, charming, charismatic people. The shinier and more arrogant and snobbier and more elitist, the more I shut down. And I tend to distance myself and watch the whole thing from the perimeter. In one case, I remember a friend of mine really falling hard for such a charming person at a party and wanting to keep talking and even started dating this person, but I wasn't having it. And he could tell. I kind of saw who he was. Very early in the game, he started talking about me in a way that was meant to cause suspicion in her. Almost right away, the isolation game starts early when the narcissistic person has found their mark and they don't want other people to mess up their game. But let's go back to that social perceptiveness. Their skill at this actually can trick people into thinking that the person is not narcissistic, right? Because they understand people, right? New and even old observers of this narcissistic person may take the stance that this person is so acutely aware of everyone. They remember stuff about them. They ask lots of questions. They pick up the inconsistencies in the conversation. They must be empathic because they're so keen and sharp when it comes to what other people are doing or saying or what they're about. And this is a common error that people make. Social perceptiveness is not the same as empathy. In fact, this is why the entire realm of emotional intelligence and narcissism can get really thorny. Because in their fashion, the narcissistic people are very emotionally intelligent. They wouldn't be so successful if they weren't. The exception to this really are the vulnerable narcissistic folks who don't have this skill. But all of the other subtypes of narcissism have it. And their social perceptiveness is only focused on themselves. Read the room to benefit themselves. Who can do something for them in the room? Who may be the threat in the room that might unmask them? Who is the one who's easy prey in the room? Narcissistic people have an uncanny capacity to smell out weaknesses. Again, they can in essence sort of case the joint and figure out how to steal who and what they want. That, folks, is not empathy. Don't get me wrong. It is one hell of a skill to be that socially perceptive, especially if you're a strategist, a tactician, a negotiator, a lawyer, a person who's trying to close a deal. But it's not a person who really cares, who is listening to you and being present in your service as well, to be present with you, to care for you, and to help you. This social perceptiveness, kind of hollow social perceptiveness, is one of those subtle warning signs. So be careful to not confuse their social skill with empathy. The social skill can trick you, but as always, when you're in the presence of someone, pay attention to how you feel. In many ways, no matter how socially perceptive they are, it can feel like they are looking through you and not at you when they are talking to you. And just being a great conversationalist, that's not empathy. That's charm. Keep them separate, and trust me, if they sense that you can sort of smell them out and see through their mask, they will avoid you, but they also may talk smack about you. We are told that people who are socially skilled are somehow virtuous. It's not that easy, and it can take a minute to figure this out. None of this is simple, and some of these elements of narcissism can, if nothing else, I hope you can hear this and recognize it makes sense why I was played, because I actually thought this person was empathic. We've all made this mistake. I hope that helps, and thanks again.